A flour sack and a whiskey bottle thumped on the table. Colt Mercer tapped the glass with a yellowed fingernail. "Your price," he said. The lamp flickered as January wind slipped through the gaps and pinched out the flame. Cold filled the room like water. Nell Hart kept her eyes on the thread in her lap. The needle moved through a torn cuff with the quiet focus of someone who had learned not to miss a stitch. Her fingers were raw from soap and winter. The thread knotted and she teased it loose. "You hearing me, girl?" "I hear you." Colt leaned close enough that she caught the sour off his breath. "Word is you can't hold a man," he said, like he was mentioning the weather. "Word is you can't carry a child either." He glanced at the bottle. "Told Tate I'd make it worth his time." Nell set the mended cuff aside. The room had one window, and it held a rectangle of pale snow haze, the kind of light that made everything look thin. She reached for her shawl on the chair back. It was more whole than wool. Buck Tate waited by the door hat in hand, eyes down at the plank floor. He had the shoulders of a man who lifted crates more than he spoke. "Boone's place is up the North Fork," he said. "I was supposed to bring nails and salt." Colt smiled without teeth. "You're bringing help." "I didn't ask to go," Nell said. The words came even and small. "You don't ask for much," Colt said. He pushed open the door. Wind rushed in and raised gooseflesh up her arms. "Then this'll be easy." The wagon stood in a ragged cradle of ruts and ice. Buck helped Nell up with a gloved hand and did not look at her when he did it. The mule Sully tossed its head and snorted steam. Buck clucked to him and the wagon creaked forward boards, complaining with each frozen bump. Miner's Rest fell behind in a scatter of rooftops and smoke. The road turned to a trail. Snow in the ditches was glazed and sharp. Pines crowded close black-green with tips dipped in white. The air tasted of iron. When she breathed out, her breath made a ghost. Buck didn't talk for miles. He passed her a tin cup with coffee gone thin and bitter. She cupped it in both hands and let the heat crawl into her knuckles. "Boone doesn't come down much," he said finally. "Keeps to himself, listens to weather more than people." She watched the way his breath lifted and broke in the air. The wagon bed had a corner of burlap that hadn't iced over, and she tucked her feet under it. She pinched the shawl tight at her throat. Somewhere deep in the timber, a bird called once, and then went quiet. "You ever been up high, Miss Hart?" "No." "Snow mends some things," Buck said. "It hides tracks, makes men think they started clean." He clicked his tongue at Sully. "Or it just covers what they don't want to see." They reached a fork where a narrow cut climbed between rock ribs. Buck pulled the mule to a stop. He nodded at a tunnel of trees painted with frost. "This is as far as he goes," he said. "Cabin's up there. He'll hear the mule and come down." Nell climbed down. Her boots sank to the ankle, then held. She steadied her bundle against her hip. She could feel her heartbeat through the cloth. Buck fished a folded paper from his coat and smoothed it with a palm so cracked it looked like dry riverbed. He tucked it into her hand. He'll want to read it. The mule shook its harness. Buck tipped his hat, already turning the wagon. "Be warm," he said, not quite looking at her. She stood while the wagon groaned away and the trees swallowed the sound of it. Wind braided her hair across her mouth. She spat out a strand and listened. Somewhere up the cut, wood cracked clean. The second blow landed. She followed the sound. The trail had patches of ice under powder, slick as glass. She set each foot the way you do when you don't want to fall, and you don't want to look like you're thinking about falling. The bundle grew heavy. Needle thread, 2 shirts, a tin of buttons, a book with half the pages gone. She kept these in her mind the way you count when you're alone. He stepped out of the trees with an axe in one hand and a length of split spruce on his shoulder. Elias Boone had a beard that caught snow and eyes the color of old walnut oil. The coat on his back looked like it had been lived in more than worn. He took in the bundle, the thin shawl, the paper in her glove. "You lost, miss." "You are Mr. Boone." He startled slightly at the formal sound of it. "Elias," he said. "Most folks do that." He set the wood down. "You here for the wrong reason, I expect." She offered the paper. Her fingers had gone slow in the cold. He unfolded it and read. His jaw worked once small. "I ordered nails and salt," he said. He flicked the paper with 2 fingers. "Not a person." Nell kept her chin raised. The wind got stronger, pushed into the gap of her coat. The paper could have been a leaf for all the weight it had. "I didn't ask to be a part of it." He glanced past her at the empty trail, then at the sky. The light was going flat, grainy like unwashed wool. His breath clouded and vanished. He tucked the paper into his own pocket. "Road is drifted," he said. "You'll freeze standing still. There's a fire at the cabin." He picked up the wood and started up the path. She followed without needing to be told. The cabin sat with its back to a bank of firs. Smoke lifted from a pipe in a thin, patient line. He shouldered open the door, and heat hit her in the face, not soft, not sweet, but glad as blood coming back to numb fingers. He shook snow from his coat and added the splits to a stacked corner by the hearth. "Sit there," he said, pointing at a chair near the stove. "Keep your feet off the stone, it steals heat." He poured coffee from a blackened pot and pushed the tin cup toward her. The cup burned her palms in a way she welcomed. "I can pay," she said, "the lie small but clean." He took off his gloves. Hands scarred over with the flat white lines work leaves. "Keep your money. Coffee's cheap." He looked at her shawl. "You come from town today?" "Yes." He nodded. He kept the space between them wide. He moved like a man who had learned his body could frighten people without meaning to. He ladled stew from a pot that smelled of venison and onion. He tore a heel of bread and set it beside the bowl. The spoon clicked once against the tin. "Eat." She did. Steam fogged her lashes, and she blinked through it until the bowl showed its bottom. Her stomach spread warm, slow, a little hurt, and then better. She placed the spoon beside the bowl. "Thank you." He stripped a glove of melted ice and hung it on a peg. He looked at the folded paper again without touching it. "I didn't send for you," he said, voice even. "I don't have business buying anyone." "I know. You got anyone to go back to if the road opens?" She stared at the stove door. Orange pulsed through the grate and then dimmed and then pulsed again. The sound of the fire was a small animal breathing. She thought of Colt's fingers on the bottle. "No." He nodded once. "There's a cot by the hearth. You can take it." He paused and studied the edge of the table like words were written there, and he needed to read them before he spoke them. "I fix things better in the morning." She looked at his hands, the webbing of scars. "Do you fix people?" "No. Wood and traps. Roof when it needs it." He pushed the axe into a corner and untied a roll of leather. From it he pulled a carving knife and a piece of pine. He sat. The knife whispered against the grain. Curled shavings gathered and smelled faintly of sap. "A bird," she said after a time, because the shape of a head had come out of the block. "Just something to keep the quiet from getting thick," he said. Nell wrapped her shawl close and studied the flames. The room had creaks and ticks that belonged to it, and they settled into her ear. Outside, the wind shouldered at the walls. Inside, the coffee tin cooled against her palm. She let her eyes close, then opened them, then closed them again because the weight would not stay up. Elias stood and checked the latch. He turned the lamp down until the room went soft and then softer still. The wick made a sound like a moth. He set an extra blanket at the foot of the cot. He did not look at her when he did that. The door caught once and then held. The wind clawed at it and slid away. The room breathed and the fire drew, and the bird in his hand took its first small suggestion of wings. Morning had a different sound up here. The stove ticked as it cooled, and somewhere outside a blade bit wood with steady rhythm. Nell woke with her face turned toward the orange grate. For a moment she did not move, letting the heat print across her cheeks and the blanket hold her like hands. When she sat up, the air bit the tip of her nose. She folded the blanket, set it at the foot of the cot, and slipped on her boots. The leather was stiff from yesterday. She pulled her shawl close and crossed to the basin. The water there had skinned over with a film of ice. She broke it with her fingers and washed as quietly as she knew how. The door opened to white light. Elias set an armload of split spruce near the hearth. Frost clung to his beard and turned him a little silver. He nodded once at her awake face, then set the wood with care so the stack would not tumble. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He lit the coffee again, and the smell reached for her. He poured without asking and set the cup within reach. She wrapped her hands around it and let the heat find the cracks in her knuckles. "There is a broom by the door," he said after a time. "If you want something to do, the ashes need walking out, and the floor needs a sweep before the churn gets dragged over." She stood at once. "Thank you. No need for that word for work." She found the broom. The bristles had a stubborn lean to one side. Ash lifted in small gray ghosts and settled again. When she carried the pan to the door, the cold blew back in her face and turned her eyes wet. She did not blink until the ashes were outside and scattered. Elias had taken a whetstone to a blade by then slow strokes that made a faint sandy sound. The knife took an edge while the coffee stayed hot in its black pot. When she hung the broom back on its nail, he lifted a strap from the table and frowned at the rotten stitch. "You know needles," he said, not a question. She nodded. "I can mend it." He handed it over and watched without looking like he was watching. She threaded a length from the spool he kept in a tobacco tin and put the strap across her lap. The leather resisted at first, and then admitted the needle. She set the new line just inside the old and made each bite the same size. He went back to his stone. The sound of metal on grit kept time with her stitches. Out by the shed, the mule Sully stamped and blew through his nose. The sound rolled across the clearing with a puff of steam. Elias glanced toward it between strokes. "Weather is talking," he said. "What does it say?" He tapped a small tin hung on a peg. A needle behind cloudy glass had drooped. "It says the pressure is falling. Wind will swing later." She did not know how to answer that. She pulled the last stitch through and tied it neat. When she held the strap up, it looked like it might hold another season. She set it in a clean space on the table. He picked it up and ran his thumb along the seam. "Good work," he said simply. "Thank you." He put the strap aside and stood. He lifted the axe from the corner and motioned with his chin to the stacked wood. "Pile it higher," he said. "Keep the splits off the ground. The wet will steal them if you let it." She tugged on her gloves and went outside. The air had a bite that tasted like iron. When she breathed, it rose in front of her and dissolved. She stacked wood in rows like books on a shelf. The bark rasped her palms through the thin leather. Her breath made a small white engine. After a while, he came to her with a cup and steam curled in front of him. "Sit," he said. "You will make yourself sick if you do it all in one push." She sat on the step. The cup was too hot to hold long. She rested it on her knee and watched him split with a rhythm that made a pattern inside her head. His arms did not waste motion. The axe rose, fell bit, and returned. The log opened clean. Then he turned the halves and did it again. "May I ask," she said, "what you do out there besides wooden traps?" He rested the axe and rolled his shoulders once. "Listen, you can hear if the creek tucked under ice starts to run high or if the snow is crusting out back where the slope is steep." He pointed with his chin at a line of trees. "A few winters ago, the hill let go. It took a shed and almost took me. I learned to listen proper." She warmed her fingers on the cup. "Does the snow warn you in time?" "Sometimes. Sometimes the warning is that you do not hear anything at all." He lifted the axe again. She watched his breath feather and vanish and kept the cup close to her mouth so her face would not go cold. By noon the sun cut through a film of cloud and made the fresh pile shine a little. Inside the cabin smelled of meat and onion when he lifted the lid of the pot. She set the table without being told. He passed her a bowl and kept one for himself, and for a long time they ate in quiet. The spoon clicked. The fire breathed low. It was not tense silence. It was the kind you can live in. A small box sat near the shelf. It had a crank that wanted turning. She brushed dust from its top. It startled a tune, and then failed after 2 thin notes. He looked up. "Hers," he said. He did not say who. "I can try to clean it," she said. "Leave it." He was gentle with the words. Some things play better in memory. She set her hand away from it and finished her stew. When she lifted her cup again, the coffee had gone from hot to drinkable. She took a mouthful and tasted the bitter in a way that made her awake. Later, she followed him to the tree line. He showed her with a flat hand where a snare sat hidden under snow and where his boot prints had turned to keep the scent from pooling. He spoke little, and when he did, he spoke to the air in front of him, as if that air might store the words for later. "If you need water," he said, pointing to a stand of alders, "there is a cut that stays open. Step on the dark patches. That is where the water has scoured the ice into ripples. The smooth parts will throw you off your feet quick." She tested a step and found the truth of it. The dark held, the smooth slid. She bent to fill the bucket. The cold went through her sleeves and bit the soft parts of her arms. She could not feel the tips of 2 fingers by the time it was full. On the walk back, she held the bucket close to her and kept the water from slopping over. Inside, she set the bucket on the bench and built the fire up with small kindling. When she reached for the kettle, the handle fooled her. It had sat close to the flame, and the heat burned through her glove. She dropped it, and it rattled and rang once against the iron rim. Elias crossed to her in 2 steps. He took her wrist like he was lifting a bird from a snare. His touch was careful, not claiming. He eased her fingers into the basin so the cold would draw out the heat. "You should have called," he said. "I did not want to bother you." His brow drew a little. "I do not mind being bothered." The water numbed first hurt and then ache. He let go and did not crowd her. He turned back to the stove and righted the kettle and set it where it would warm without biting. She watched the steam rise thin as thread. By late afternoon, the light went thin and blue. Elias set a ladder against the eave and went up to check the shingles. She stood at the base and held the wood steady. The wind found a low whistle at the edge of the roof. He pressed on a loose board, and it bumped under his palm. "That one did not seat right," he said. "I will set it solid when the weather steadies." "Is it going to turn?" He climbed down with the ladder on his shoulder. He tapped the tin on the wall again once he was inside. The needle sat lower now. The same sound the kettle had made earlier came again from the roof, a light rattle where the loosened shingle met its nail. She set a pot of water on the stove, and the coil in the steam lifted a curl of hair off her forehead. She tucked it back without thinking. He noticed, then looked away, and pulled a square of cloth from the drawer and set it near her hand. "For your hand later if it blisters," he said. "Thank you." Supper ran simple, bread stew against salt from a jar. He ate with the same quiet he worked with. She filled the space by humming under her breath. Not a song with proper words, just a fair tune that wandered. He slowed the way a man does when he hears something he has not intended to hear. When she noticed, she let it soften and then vanish. After they cleaned up, he sat with a block of pine and that small knife. He did not ask permission to carve in his own space. He did not need it. The knife made thin curls that piled like shavings of butter. A head, then a beak, then a breast. A small bird that looked like it was listening for something. She threaded a new needle and mended the thumb of a glove that had gone open from use. The thread slid in and out, and the movement took her mind into a quiet place where the day could settle. Her burned fingers complained and then got used to the work. "You carry that tune from somewhere," he said. "A traveling show came through 1 year. They sold sugar candy and promises. The tune stayed, not the promises." He smiled quick and small, gone almost before she saw it. The knife kept working. The bird grew a little more itself. When the lamps were turned low, she stood at the door with a cloak around her shoulders for one last breath of outside air. The cold worked quick on her skin and made the world prickle awake. The clearing held moonlight in the ruts, and the trees pressed together like a crowd. In the edge of that light, she saw a line of tracks separate from boot marks. She squatted, winced at the cold in her knees, and studied the pads and claws. "Wolves," she said quietly. "They run the ridge," he answered from the table. "They do not want us unless we invite them. Close the door and do not leave scraps near the stoop." She came back inside and made sure the latch set. The room gathered itself. The cabin had its own breaths. The gaps in the logs talked a little. The kettle sighed, and the fire turned small sticks into hot coal. He set the bird on the shelf above the stove. It was not finished. The head was smooth, but one wing was only a suggestion. He did not apologize for the incomplete shape. "I will keep track of your work by this," he said, "each day another feather." "Then it will have a chest full of them," she said, wondering if it was too much to say. He looked at her hand wrapped now in a strip of cloth and at the line of stitches she had put in his glove. He cleared his throat. "I make all sorts of small things, so the nights are not too long." She nodded and pulled the blanket on the cot up and over the pillow to set a place for her head. She slid her boots off and set them neatly so she could find them without fumbling. The lamplight made a warm circle around the table and did not reach the corners. The corners did not feel unfriendly. Outside, the wind shifted. It found the loose shingle and made it speak. The sound carried soft through the wall. Elias lifted his head and listened, then fixed the stove and set the poker aside. "Storm is turning," he said mostly to himself. The lamp trembled a little and steadied. Nell touched the small wooden bird and felt the hint of a wing under her finger as the house settled around them. By dusk, the wind had turned mean. It came in off the ridge and found every seam in the cabin walls. The loose shingle spoke now and then a small rattle like a nail dreaming. Elias checked the latch twice, then slid a length of wood into the brackets across the door. The bar sat with a solid sound that settled in Nell's bones. He pulled the ladder inside so it would not blow off its own feet. Sully stamped in the lean-to and rattled his halter. Nell fed the stove small sticks first so the coal would wake without choking. The lamplight thinned as if the glass itself had gone cold. "We tie what can be tied," Elias said. He set a coil of rope on the table and cut lengths with the small blade he used for carving. Window shutters, the smoke pipe where it meets the roof, the shed door. She nodded and wrapped her shawl close and went out behind him. The door pushed at her when she tried to close it like a big shoulder wanted in. Snow came sideways. Elias moved like he had done this before. He handed a line to her and pointed to the loop he wanted. She caught it pulled until it sang tight and set a knot that would not crawl loose. Her fingers went stiff. His hands worked faster, not because he was impatient, but because he understood weather and wanted to finish before it got teeth. They tugged the shed door until it met the frame and crossed a rope over it twice. Inside the lean-to, the mule rolled an eye and snorted. "Easy," Elias said, low and even. He dragged a sack of grain close so Sully could smell food and forget the sound of the sky. When they came back and snow had dusted Nell's hair along the part. She shook it free, and the flakes flashed once in lamplight and vanished. Elias kicked the door shut with his heel and threw the bar. The room caught a small silence when the wind was on the other side again. The first drip hit the tin pail under the weak point in the roof, a bright ping, then another. Elias looked up, then hung a second pail where the seam had started to sweat. The stove breathed stronger. The room smelled of sap and hot iron and wet wool. "Sit," he said. His voice was rough from wind and quiet living. He stripped off his coat and set it around her shoulders without making her reach. It held the outdoors in it and the heat of his work and something clean that was just him. The coat was heavy enough to hush the shake that had started in her back. "I can help," she said. "You did," he said. He nodded at the shutters and the tied pipe. He poured coffee and slid the cup toward her. His hands were nicked where rope had burned and the cuts had learned to close. He flexed them once as if they were remembering something that was not pain. The pail took another drop. The sound became a slow count. The window went from gray to slate to a deep iron blue. When Nell breathed, she saw it. Elias breathed slower, and the fog from him went less far. He set a second lamp on the table and turned it low. The wick hummed. He took the bird down and set it in his palm. It had a head and a beak and one low ridge where a wing would be. He sat, and the knife found the grain like it knew a path. "You ever think a place listens back?" she said. He looked up. "Sometimes I think the hills hear my footsteps and answer with their own, sometimes with nothing." He returned to the small blade. The curls fell in quiet spirals. He kept his thumb careful so the knife would not walk. She held her cup with both hands and let the heat bite. She watched his mouth decide between words and work. He chose work. The wind shoved the wall and then pulled away like something thinking better. The loose shingle made its small speech and stopped. "I did not send for you," he said after a while. "I meant that. If the road clears and you want down, I will take you." She took a breath slow because anything quick hurt in the cold air. "Thank you." He set the knife aside and rubbed his palms together to bring life back to the places near the scars. "I keep space here, Nell. It keeps me too. I do not owe anybody my quiet. That is what I tell myself." And now she said, he looked at the coat on her shoulders. The answer did not show up easy. "I do not like the thought of that road and you on it alone. That much I know." She looked at the stove door. The fire showed itself in small flashes through the grate. "When I sat by that door in town, I learned how to be quiet enough to disappear. It is a kind of trick. You make yourself into what people do not notice." She did not look at him as she said it. "Then the road took me here and the quiet is different. It does not want me gone, it just wants me to listen." The pail pinged again. His chair creaked when he shifted. He did not reach for her hand. He looked like he wanted to, and then respected his own caution. The wind found the chimney and tried it, and failed. A thin line of smoke doubled back, and then rose true. He stood. He set his coat more square on her and tugged the collar together under her chin with 2 fingers. He did it the way a man ties a knot he has tied 10,000 times. Useful, human, no ceremony at all. "You are shaking," he said. She could not lie and make it sound like truth, a little. He set her hands between his and let the heat move. His palms were rough enough to teach the skin on her fingers another texture for warm. He did not look away while he did it. The room held its breath for both of them and then let it out. "You can have the bed pallet," he said. "I will take the chair." "I will take the cot," she said. "It is near the heat." He nodded. He did not argue at being decent. He set more wood, then listened to the way the draft changed when the door opened and closed and found the right place for the stove vent. The storm hit its stride. By then the glass in the lamps had gone milky with the cold on the other side. The flame threw strange shadows on the logs. The pail filled by degrees. From time to time he emptied it into a bucket by the door and set it back. Water gathered on his forearms. He shook it off, and it went to the floor in a spray that flashed in the light and vanished. She helped without getting in his way. She held the ladder when he needed to reach the seam. She lifted the small pail while he set the larger. When her glove stuck to the iron rim again, he shifted her hand and made the work safe, not because he wanted to command, but because he knew more about where heat hid. The night deepened. The wind lost the high whistle and traded it for a low, clean push. At some point, she stopped feeling the cold in her teeth. The cabin had warmed like bread just out of a bake oven. The coffee had gone to the bottom of the pot and toward bitter. He set the bird back on the shelf. A new shallow line had appeared along one side where a wing was starting to live. He stood near her and did nothing about closing the last small space. She raised her eyes and found his waiting. His face had taken on that concentration woodworkers have when the knife is near the edge. Not anxiety, care. He lifted a hand and stopped before he touched. She finished the distance and set her mouth on his. He tasted like coffee and cold air. He did not rush her. He let it be a question, and he waited for her to answer again. She did. When they drew apart, the stove clicked twice metal talking as it settled. He rested his forehead to hers. He breathed once, and she felt it. "If you ask me to take you down when the ridge clears, I will hitch Sully and do it," he said. "I will not ask why." "If I stay," she said, "can you live with a person who hums while she cooks and puts thread everywhere and asks where you keep the soap because she wants the floors to stop squeaking?" He shut his eyes and opened them. "Yes." She smiled with a part of her face that had forgotten how. "Then I'm not in a rush to reach any road." He took the blanket from the cot and shook it open and set it over her knees. He checked the bar at the door again and tested the rope he had tied to the small hook in the beam. He sat on the chair by the table and turned the lamp down until the walls took the light and made it softer. The wind kept at the cabin, but the sound had changed. It had lost the wrongness. It moved like weather that could be understood. Snow tapped the window in a steady hand. Somewhere a branch knocked twice and then went quiet. Near dawn, the storm thinned to a breath. The stove showed a dull red through the ash and needed new wood. Elias rose to tend it and did not wake her. When she stirred, he was setting a kettle where the heat would find it moving slow so the metal would not argue. She sat and pulled the coat tighter and watched him. He poured a little water into a basin and washed the night from his hands. He glanced at her, and something relieved passed through his face. He lifted the bird and turned it in his palm like a promise he would not speak yet. They stepped outside once the light was proper. The world had gone to glass and sugar. The sky was the pale color of new milk. Sound seemed to travel farther. Their boots made crisp cuts in the crust. The air smelled rinsed. The roofline wore a clean white edge where he had tied the pipe. The loose shingle had lost its voice. He checked the lean-to. Sully chewed and stamped like the storm had been a story someone told him. Nell shook the blanket out and hung it on a peg so the sun would touch it through the small window. She set her sewing tin on the table and did not tuck it away again. His knife roll sat open beside it, 2 lives sitting side by side without reaching for corners. Toward noon, a sound came up the draw that did not belong to weather. Not the creek loosening under ice, not a branch. Metal on leather slow and measured. A horse found its way through fir shadow and into light. Elias turned his head and looked out past the door frame, then looked at Nell. The air in the room changed without the wind. The sound came up the draw in small pieces. Bit of leather, bit of bit, ring a careful breath from a horse that knew ice. Elias set his palm on the door frame. Nell felt the air in the room settle. She wiped her hands on the cloth by the basin and stood where he could see her if he turned his head. The rider appeared where the firs broke and the light caught him. Colt Mercer sat his bay like a man who liked being looked at. Mud was dried in a map up his boots. A bruise lived on his jaw under dark stubble. He pulled the horse up short and let it toss its head, then smiled without any warmth at all. "Afternoon," he said, rolling the word in his mouth. Elias stepped out. He did not cross the door until Colt had already swung down. The rifle rode easy across Elias's forearm, not raised, not loose. Sully shook his halter in the lean-to and blew a short, unhappy breath. A crow in the far tree threw 2 hard calls and flew. "You boon," Colt said. Elias nodded. "I came to pick up what you paid for. I did not pay for a person." Colt laughed at that like the line was a joke he had already heard. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and shook it once. "Miner's Rest saw the trade," he said. He snapped the paper with 2 fingers so it gave a cheap crackle. "Grain and whiskey for a girl who knows her chores and keeps her mouth easy." Nell stood in the doorway, and the cold reached around her ankles. She kept the shawl closed at her throat, and the cotton under it held the smell of stew and wood smoke. Colt looked past Elias and let his eyes rest on her like a weight. "There she is," he said. "You looked smaller up close last time. New coat suits you." Elias did not turn. He spoke so Colt would not have to hear Nell answer first. "She is not yours. She is not mine. She is hers." Colt grinned, now teeth an uneven fence. "That is a pretty mountain riddle. Out here you might make it law. Down valley I have a paper says different." He held it out. Elias did not touch it. The wind lifted the corner and set it back down. The horse chewed the bit and made a wet creak. Nell stepped forward until she stood beside Elias instead of behind him. She did it without looking at either man. Her boots found the packed snow and held. She folded her hands, then let them unclasp because they were not children. She looked at Colt in a plain way. "I'm not your cargo." His eyes sharpened. He seemed surprised she spoke, and more surprised the sound had steadiness. He rolled his shoulders like he had to settle something. "You always thought you were more than you are, Nell." He tipped his chin toward the rifle. "You going to shoot me, mountain man? You think that scares me." Elias watched Colt's hands, not his mouth. The right hand rested near the coat hem. It could find a grip there if it wanted. Elias set the rifle a little higher across his arm. He did not sight down it. He did not need to. His voice went lower, not louder. "You can get back on your horse now." Colt lifted the paper and let it flutter once. He laughed so he would not have to swallow. "She was barren last she was mine," he said. "Sold honest. No use. You take the trouble if you like. You will find it gets heavy." Nell did not flinch. Her breath came out and showed itself. Then came again and did not. She spoke as if she were reading a list and wanted to be done with it. "You put a price on me because you do not know what anything means unless you can hold it up to a bottle. This place is not yours. My body is not yours." Elias felt something inside him move, not a new thing, but an old thing loosening. He kept his eyes on Colt. "She works here," he said. "She holds the roof and the kettle and the hours together. That is more life than you have given in all your minutes." Colt spat into the dirty snow and missed his own boot by an inch. "That talk is pretty." He shifted his weight and the horse moved a hind foot. The leather creaked. His hand brushed his coat. Elias set the rifle to the notch of his shoulder in one clean motion. He did not pull the hammer. He did not take his eye off Colt. "Do not," Elias said. The space went tight and small. The cold bit hard at the gap of skin between glove and sleeve. The wind held itself for a count of 3. Colt's hand stayed where it was. His grin died a visible death. "You think I am afraid of you," he said, but the words did not carry right. "I think you will not risk bleeding in the snow for a paper that will not keep you warm," Elias said. They looked at each other until the look got old. A little color left Colt's face and went somewhere out behind him in the trees. He flicked the paper like it stung him, then shoved it into his coat. "Not finished," Colt said. He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up in one hard move. He gathered the reins with quick hands and sawed the bay into a turn that sprayed slush. He did not look back as he took the narrow track down through the firs. His horse blew loud once, then the sound thinned and folded into the distance. The clearing held the silence that comes after a door shuts. Elias lowered the rifle and set it inside the cabin. He did not follow Colt with his eyes. He looked at Nell. "You all right?" She nodded, then nodded again, because the first move felt too small. Her hands had done a thing of their own, and were shaking now that they could. She pressed the edges of her shawl to her chest. Her breath went high and thin, then dropped and steadied. He reached up and set his palm against her cheek. The touch was weight and heat, nothing else. "You did that," he said. "So did you." "Always," he said. Inside the stove had fallen to a dull red bed. He opened the door and set 2 splits in and waited for the draft to catch. She took the bucket and the dipper and moved toward the door without thinking. "I will bring water," she said. Her voice came back to itself as if it had been sitting on a far shelf. The path to the stream had seen morning sun. The top inch of snow had gone to wet sugar. Under that a crust waited, and under that the old ice ran like glass. The alders threw narrow shadows across the cut. The water showed in a thread of dark, and the sound of it was a thin music under the crust. She stepped where Elias had taught her. Dark patches held. Smooth parts tried to throw her feet, and she did not let them. She bent to dip the bucket, and the cold went into her through the cuffs and up her sleeves to the soft inside of her arms. She waited while the bucket filled so it would not slop on the way back. Her heart tagged along hard and quick without asking. On the climb from the cut, her breath went wrong. The trees slid a little at the edges of her sight and came back. She stopped and stood still and told her body to listen. The bucket rope bit her palm. The sound of the stream was larger now and closer, though she had stepped away from it. A small white film passed over her vision and cleared. She took one more step, and the ground did a small trick under her, the kind you do not see until it has happened. One boot slid on smooth ice hidden under wet snow. Her knee buckled. She fought to keep the water because you do not waste what you carry. The bucket swung and caught her hip, and the weight pulled her sideways. The world tilted. The rim of the bucket knocked a stone and rang once. Cold rushed up and through her. She heard the thin music of the stream resolve into a fuller sound as the bucket's lip bit under and the water went out and away. "Elias," she said, but it was a small sound that the alders kept for themselves. He was already coming. He had watched through the window the way he watched weather. He had seen the line of her shoulders change and knew a story by it. He ran with his body low and quiet. Snow came up at his steps and settled again. He slid the last 2 yards and dropped to his knees beside her. His hands found the back of her head before they found the bucket. He did not shake her. He set his palm to the side of her neck and felt for heat. Water slipped past his boots and braided into the stream in a clean sheet. He said her name and the trees heard it. Her lids fluttered once, then held. The stream kept its song. The wind moved in the tops of the firs. His breath spilled white into the air and vanished. He gathered her up with the same care he gave wood shavings and sharp blades and the one small bird on the shelf, and the cold touched his face as he lifted. The bucket lay upside down with a thin ring of ice already starting around its edge. Elias lifted her and felt the weight of wet cloth and cold bone. He carried her up the cut boots, finding the dark patches, breath going white and thin. Inside, he set her near the stove and stripped the soaked shawl and wrapped her in both blankets. He fed the fire with dry spruce until the stove took hold, and the iron went from dull to living red. Nell's lashes fluttered. Her lips were pale. He set her hand in his palms and chafed until the numb gave way to ache. He spoke her name once, low and steady. Her eyes opened glassy at first, then finding him. "I slipped," she said, voice small. "You are here," he said. He put a pan of water on and stirred a spoon of sugar in until it vanished. He lifted her head and gave her sips. Color crept back into her mouth. The blanket shook where it lay against her ribs and then steadied. "I'm going to fetch the doctor," he said. She nodded. He pulled on his coat, tied a scarf over his mouth, and took Sully from the lean-to. The mule rolled an eye but stood for the saddle. Elias swung up and turned down the track toward Miner's Rest. Snow broke at the mule's chest in small waves. Trees slid by like thick ribs. The wind was easier now, a patient thing that let a man breathe. At the trading post, the bell hung on a hook and clinked once in the draft. Dr. Naomi Reyes had set up there for a few days to see to frostbite baby fevers and cuts that went wrong. She was packing a case when Elias came in with winter still on him. He did not waste words. "A woman at my place. She fell. She is cold and she is tired and she is not herself." Reyes shut the case and lifted her coat from a nail. She had quick hands and a look that did not rattle. "Tell me what you saw." He told her. She listened. Then she said, "Take me." They rode double on Sully, the doctor's bag wedged between them. The mule picked sure steps. The sun dragged low along the ridge and made long blue shadows. By the time they reached the cabin, the stove had the room to a gentle bake, and the air smelled like hot iron and wet wool. Reyes went to Nell at once, fingers firm and gentle, the way you handle a threaded needle before it bites cloth. "Your name, sweetheart?" "Nell Hart." "How long have you felt light in the head?" "A few days," Nell said. "When I stand too fast, the edges go away." Reyes listened to her chest, then counted a pulse at the wrist. She pressed at the soft place above the hip and watched Nell's face. She asked questions like she was checking fence for gaps. When she finished, she smiled in a way that put warmth in the room. She glanced at Elias in the doorway and gave a small nod before she spoke. "You are not sick in the way you fear," she said. "You are carrying. Strong heartbeat. You need food, water, and rest, and you need not to lift anything that wants to be as heavy as a stump." Nell held very still. Then her laugh came out in a breath that turned to a sound she could not hold back. She looked at Elias, and there was water in her eyes, but not from the cold. They said she started. Then she did not finish because what had been said belonged to a different room. Reyes set a hand on Nell's shoulder and felt the tremor that runs out of a body when it stops holding itself like a board. "You will be fine if you take it easy," she said. "Eat what he puts in front of you. Sleep when your bones say sleep. I will come back in a month and look again." Elias stood without moving for a count he did not measure. He let his breath go, and it shook once. "Thank you," he said. After Reyes left, he split wood with a lightness he did not know he carried. He went to the loose shingle and set it right nails seated seam sealed with pitch that smoked sweet in the cold air. He ran a hand over the board and felt the roof's answer a small quiet that meant it would hold rain. Inside, Nell mended the thumb of his glove. She had left half done her stitches even as fence posts. Their work spoke to each other across the room. Days turned and the valley's face changed. Snow pulled back from the alders and left wet dark on the earth. The creek lifted its voice. Elias carved a cradle from pine that had stood straight and clean. He set his knife to the grain and drew out a curve that fit his palm. He cut columbine into the rail's petals, shallow and sure. Along the headboard a small wren grew from the block, head cocked, breast round the beak, open to a song only it could hear. Nell pieced a quilt for the cradle from scraps she had carried up the mountain. A bit of her old shawl found a place near the center. She ran a line of stitches through it, and the cloth learned a new purpose. She hummed when she worked not for company, just because it was there. He paused sometimes with the knife in air and listened, then smiled to himself and dropped the curl to the floor. They planted a small patch when the soil took a finger without biting it. Potatoes, onions, a row of beans near the fence. He worked the ground with a fork, and she set seeds with care. The wind went soft and pushed the smell of turned earth into the house. On the shelf, the small wooden bird kept watch over the stove. Each week a new feather appeared along the wing. Word in town traveled like water. It got into things. Colt's paper lost its power when it met a room in the mountains where nothing was for sale. Elias did not speak his name. Nell did not spend time thinking on him. The work of living took up space where other thoughts might have nested. When the first cold came back to the high ground, Reyes returned with a fresh roll of clean cloths and hands that knew their business. Night fell early. The stove groaned and gave heat. The pain came in waves that set and broke, and Nell learned the trick of breathing, so it did not run away with her. Elias stood where his hands could be taken if needed. He poured water warm towels and said little that would not help. The cry came sharp and new. It lifted the room and startled the stove into a click. Reyes wiped the small face and set the child on Nell's chest. Dark curls lay wet against a small skull. The hands were tight fists. The mouth made its complaint with vigor. Strong lungs, Reyes said, a hint of pride hiding in the practical tone. That is good. Nell ran a finger along a soft cheek. The skin was warm, and the breath puffed against her skin like a moth. She laughed, and the sound had the wobble of someone who has found an extra room in a house she thought she knew. She is perfect, Elias said, voice low. Nell looked up. His face had gone new in a way that surprised her. He had lived long with caution set in his bones. Some part of it had stepped back. She smiled at him and then back at the child. Wren, she said, for the little bird that kept us company. Elias nodded. He touched the tiny hand and felt fingers close around the end of his. He set the cradle near the stove and laid the quilt in it, the piece of old shawl, right in the center, like a quiet flag. He carried the whiskey bottle that had sat on the shelf since winter. He took it out under the eave and turned it over. The sharp smell rose, then thinned and was gone. He set the glass in the trash pit and covered it with a flat stone. Morning came clear. Light spilled across the floorboards and climbed the legs of the table. Smoke went up straight from the pipe and made a fine line against a pale sky. The cabin breathed. Nell lifted Wren and settled into the chair. The small mouth found milk. The sound in the room changed to include it. Elias hooked the finished wooden bird on a nail above the stove. It cast a small shadow on the log and looked toward the cradle like it had always meant to. He checked the roof one more time, then came back in and pushed the door with his boot until the latch answered. He stood with his hand on the jamb for a quiet second and took in the room. Then he crossed to Nell and set his palm against her hair. "We are here," he said. She nodded. Wren's breath went fast and small and content. Outside, the creek went on with its song softened by distance, steady as work. The columbine on the headboard caught a piece of sun and held it. The room settled around the three of them and felt right. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.